I'm going to be talking to Kingsmill Bond, one of my favorite interviewees. He's a senior principal in the Strategic Analysis and Engagement Group of the Rocky Mountain Institute, which is headquartered in Boulder, Colorado, but he's going to be speaking to us from the UK. So welcome to the interview, Kingsmill.
Hi, Markham. Good to be back. Thank you.
I'm really excited here. You have produced, you and your team, I guess, let's credit where credit's due. You have produced a theory on the peak, plateau, and demand for fossil fuels in the global energy system. And
peak
right
plateau
on
decline even.
And decline. My mistake, sorry.
Sorry.
But
Peak plateau
I'm going to admit some confirmation bias here right at the beginning, because you use S-curves, you use a lot of the theory that I first started using back in the mid 80s when I was working on my master's thesis, and have used ever since. And so I'm biased. I think that your theory best reflects what's going on in the global energy system and in national and subnational energy systems. As I interview 400 or 500 people a year, read studies, on, and your theory reflects that reality. So whether you're watching video or listening to this on the podcast, settle in, because Kingsmill and I are going to have a very interesting conversation over the next 50 minutes to an hour. And Kingsmill, before we get into the meat of your theory, how are things at Rocky Mountain Institute? Because you used to be at Carbon Tracker and you moved over about a year ago, and you're doing some very interesting work there.
Yeah, I think, well, first of all, it's really fun working for RMI. I mean, I guess I sort of should say that, but it's a very inspiring organization, and it's fun to work with people who are great believers in the energy transition and the opportunities. And of course, the other point about RMI, of course, is we have teams in lots of different locations and with people who focus on lots of different areas. So China or India or Africa, and indeed teams across the global south. And then I'm also working with teams who are looking at electricity and transport, and hydrogen. And for me, of course, this is kind of like it's particularly interesting because if we have the kind of framing and the global narrative, and actually you can work with people who are making change happen on the ground and see to what degree these ideas apply to those sectors, and that I think helps to certainly deepen and strengthen the argument in many ways.
Now, are we going to see you in North America occasionally?
Yeah, no, the plan is to working with the finance team to do more work with the financial sector in the US in particular, and really to go out to the finance sector next year and go, look, this is really not an ESG issue. This is a technology shift, and it's happening at speed, and you need to be aware of that and to reflect that in the way you're allocating capital. And to agree, some people are doing this, but quite a lot aren't, and quite a lot, I would suggest, are kind of behind the curve, not recognizing the speed of change that's going on.
Right. To use the Everett's Rogers terms, there have been innovators and early adopters, but we still are probably in the early majority stage, and we need to get up that curve so that the late majority and the laggards are allocating capital as well to the new energy technologies. Well, that's great. I'm glad to hear that you're going to be in North America. With any luck, I will catch up to you sometime in 2023, and we'll have a coffee and get better acquainted. So let's get better acquainted with your theory. Give me a very short overview of that theory and how it works.
Sure. Well, I mean, it's kind of, you to call it a theory. It's probably a little bit. It's just an observation of the way the change is happening in the energy sector, in the same way as it has happened in many other sectors and many other countries over time. And our simple observation is that as new technology grows rapidly on S-curves, as you mentioned, it creates this peak plateau decline framework for the old technologies. That is to say, the old technology, first of all, reaches a peak of demand. That is to say, it stops growing, and we're kind of there for the energy system we suggest as a whole. And then it bounces along a plateau for a few years because it does take time for the new stuff to move up an S-curve and get big enough to really start displacing enormous systems. But then eventually it gets big enough, and at that point, you get a very clear you very clearly get decline for the old energy technology, and that in a nutshell is the overall observation. And we've been writing a series of reports just demonstrating, first of all, how and why it works and why it matters, and then running through how it's been playing out across the OECD and then across the electricity sector, transportation sector, and actually one sector and country after the next.
Well, let's talk about the conventional framing briefly, which is, I think, Vaclav Smil is the personification of that particular view, which is that energy transitions take many, many decades, 50 to 75 years, typically. And this one is going to take just as long. And my problem with that is that the technologies that are at the heart of the energy transition, we're talking wind and solar and lithium ion batteries and electric vehicles, they've been on the flat part of the S-curve, the very beginning of the S-curve, for 20, 30, 40 years. It's not like this energy transition sprang into being in 2020 or 2010. It's been gestating for a long time. And I think I've debated Smil, fanboys about this, and they refuse to yield the point. But I think this is the fundamental weakness of Smil's worldview, is that when you're on an S-curve, it goes really, really, really slow for 2, 3, 4 decades. And then you have a very disruptive decade. I call it the decade of disruption. Very original, as you can tell. and then it goes really, really fast, and then it slows down as the technology, becomes the dominant player in that particular marketplace. And that's essentially, that's the crux of how you see this playing out.
Yeah, I mean, that's precisely it. But I mean, to come back to this framing that energy transitions take decades, there is no dispute. I think it's really worthwhile saying this very, very clearly. Nobody disputes that it will take a long time to go from burning 14,000 million tons a year of fossil fuels to zero, right? But that's not the point. The point is you get disruption at the very top of the system when you go from growth to decline. And this is a kind of the difference between this ivory tower approach that is being taken by certain academics and the real world. It's not like people in the car industry said, gee, there's 1,000 million conventional cars out there in the world, and there's only 1 million electric vehicles. Let's not bother with the electric vehicle. No, they were like, oh, crikey, the world's changing really quickly. We better retool our business because consumers want electric vehicles. And as a result, I mean, again, without rehearsing the facts too aggressively, it's fairly obvious that in the last 5 years, almost the entire car industries had to retool for the new reality, in spite of the fact that almost every car on the road is still the old kind of car. And that's exactly the point. It's this moment of where you go from growth to decline, or to the ending of growth. That's the key point for financial markets. It's not, and just to finish on this, it's not as if, if you're an investor, you don't wait until if you're selling 100 widgets a year, you don't wait until you're selling 50 before you sell the share, right? You try and sell at the very top, or even slightly before the top. And that's, I guess, the difference between the academic approach and the financial market approach, which is that we're focusing on turning points, not some putative end date some decades into the future.
You make a point in your in the pieces that the articles that I've read, where you describe the theory, and I'm going to keep calling it a theory because I think I know you'll flesh it out over the coming years with more analysis, but I think you've got the makings of a theory here. Tell me why you think the very size of the fossil fuel system is actually a vulnerability.
So it's a vulnerability because, in the same way as the very size of the dinosaurs, I guess, was a vulnerability. The world changed, And because they were so enormous, they found it very hard to change with it. And here we are, an analogous situation where you have these companies which are absolutely tooled up with hundreds or tens of billions of dollars of assets in an old system, which is quite quickly being superseded by a faster moving, local, superior set of technologies, and they just don't have the skill set to survive in this new world.
Well, that's very interesting because as I think I've mentioned to you in previous interviews, I spent 5 years in the oil and gas industry from 2003 to 2008. And I got to see I was kind of setting up, I was helping companies in Canada. I was helping set up distribution networks in the United States. And so it was essentially an exercise in new technology adoption, sort of the pointy end of it. And I sat across the desk from hundreds of oil and gas engineers from Midland, Texas, to Bakersfield, California, to Gillette, Wyoming, and all over, in Canada and Calgary and so on. And here's something I learned. Oil and gas engineers, and I think this applies in other industries, are utterly amazing when it comes to innovating within their box. If you need to fix a problem at a well that's failing for some reason on a regular basis, they will come up with a solution. They're excellent about it. No question about that. Where they fail, and this is why this is relevant to your theory, is they're really poor at innovating outside the box. That's not their area of expertise, and they don't do it well. And I think that's why, you're talking about where that vulnerability comes from. That and the size of their organizations and a conservative, risk-averse corporate culture and all of that together prevents them from seeing the threat, the existential threat to their business, and pivoting to other business models that would enable them to transition to the new technologies and thrive going forward. What do you think about that?
Yeah, no, this is, I guess as we both know, what we are describing is something which is seen constantly in many other industries, in many other technology shifts. So, just to toss out a few examples, with the rise of the internet, you would have thought possibly that the old incumbents in media or retail or book selling would retool themselves and pivot to this new world that was arising, and of course they didn't. And the great opportunities were seized by companies like Google or Amazon, which were able, or Facebook, which were able to derive business models which were much more suitable for this new environment. Similar story when you switch from the mainframe to the PC, or the overused example horse to car and all the rest of it. Incumbents find it incredibly hard to shift to a new paradigm, in large part because they've got all of their talent and skill focused on the old system, and they're kind of fiddling around with the new stuff. And at the same time, people who are expert in the new technologies are devoting 100% of their attention to finding out the best ways to do it. And by the time the old industries figure out that actually this is the future, it's too late. And sorry, what I'm saying is absolutely axiomatic. You see it in lots of academic textbooks. Engines That Move Markets by Nairn is one. And then you've got the innovator's dilemma. Christensen, it's exactly what he talks about. So this is completely normal. The reason why the energy industry has been so slow to figure out what's going on is that they just haven't seen this. We basically had 200 years of continuous growth of fossil fuels, 100 years of continuous growth of oil and gas, and it's something new. It's really hard to understand.
Yeah, I find that all the time. I'm constantly talking to folks in the oil and gas industry, and their frame of reference simply isn't able to accommodate the fact that their products, for the very first time, have a competitor in electricity.
And if I may just toss out a couple of other stats, which I always find quite interesting, to look at energy history. Not sure I could quite go toe to toe with Václav Smil on energy history, but I certainly have a very different interpretation of it. And these technologies like coal and then oil and then gas, they transformed our world, growing at about 5% a year. This new stuff, solar's still growing after 40 years. It's still growing at 25% a year. This is why, again, it's so hard for incumbents to realize what's going on, because this speed of growth is absolutely unprecedented. The speed and the longevity of growth has never been seen before, and that's why they find it so hard to reconcile.
Let's talk about, I think this is a good place to segue into a discussion of the S-curve. And you have three components, three parts of it. And as I do, when I do this kind of analysis, either in my columns or for clients when I'm contracted to write papers, the first one is you call emergence, I call gestation. But I think it's basically the same thing. For instance, the lithium ion battery gets developed in the 70s and 80s, and it gets introduced in 1991. And then it takes, now it's at the beginning of the S curve, and it takes some time, it revolutionizes personal electronics, that sort of thing first, until, Tesla comes along and sticks it in a car. And and you can, there, wind has an example, is an example, solar is an example, on and on and on. So but you point out in your article the importance of innovation, and this is something that, again, the incumbents don't get, is the pace and the scale and the depth of innovation that's going on in the new energy technologies. It's nothing short of astounding. And and the amount of capital that's now following that innovation, funding startups and funding the growth of companies that have, passed their inflection point and they're growing rapidly. And it's partly rooted in the difference between the old fossil fuels and the new energy. The fossil fuels are a commodity. They behave very differently than the new technologies. Well, with the new energy, which is a technology. And I interviewed Mike Andrade, who's been in this business for 30 or 35 years, and he points to the fact that once energy is a technology, then it has different laws, like Wright's law, that govern how fast it will grow. And that's an absolute game changer.
Yeah, well, as we both know, the great expert on this whole debate has been Doan Farmer and his team at the University of Oxford, and they've analysed in enormous depth a series of different technologies over the years, and to what degree they were able to get onto learning curves, Wright's law, and one of the conclusions was, well, a number of conclusions. One of the conclusions was that it's quite unusual to get onto a learning curve. It's quite unusual for your cost to continuously fall over time as you expand your production. But once you do, then that learning curve tends to continue, which is, I guess, their second conclusion. And then they say, well, let's just think through the logic of this, assuming the growth continues, which again is highly likely because of the feedback loops between growth and cost. Then how low will prices go? And they then come up with these very, very low prices: $10 solar, $1 hydrogen, $50 batteries, and all the rest of it. By the 2030s, and that then in and of itself is cheap enough to radically reshift to change the world. But yeah, I think that type of observation is very important. I think, and then in contrast, as you say, for something like fossil fuels, which are a commodity, not a technology, they just don't get onto these learning curves, because even though there are learning curves within the industry, we get better and better at extracting stuff and further offshore. That's constantly being offset by natural decline rates and the fact that we go and get the cheapest stuff first, and therefore, from their analysis, what it's worth, fossil fuels basically are flat. The cost of fossil fuels is basically flat over a century. And it's almost impossible. It is impossible for a technology not on a learning curve to compete with a technology on a learning curve. And I kind of think this is a conversation, Markham, that you and I are having in 2022. in a decade, nobody will be having this conversation anymore. It'll be looking back and be saying how obvious it all was, and how could we possibly not have seen this coming?
Well, I would say that it's obvious now to those who are paying attention.
Obvious to us, but not necessarily obvious to everyone. Yeah.
Yeah, agreed. Before we leave the first stage on the S curve, I want to talk about a different type of innovation, and that's business model innovation. Because in some cases, it's not just about the technology; it's how that gets applied. And so, Tony Seba's early work on transportation as a system, where nobody owns a car because everybody's taking an electric robotaxi everywhere they go because it's 4 to 10 times cheaper per kilometer traveled. Or I'm seeing now innovations in things like heavy duty or medium duty trucks as a service, where if you're a fleet manager for a logistics company, and you want to go electric, you contract with one of these companies and they provide you a turnkey operation. They provide you the chargers and the infrastructure to support it. They provide you the trucks. They even provide, in some cases, the drivers. And the cost per kilometer or per mile for our American listeners and viewers is either competitive or already lower than the diesel or gasoline competitors. And it's that kind of innovation all up and down the supply chain, all up and down the value chain, that is, I think, in the end, will just spell the death of fossil fuels quicker than we expected.
Yeah, look, it's very well made. I mean, the point very well made. There is, for example, just 2 weeks ago, I saw a European leasing company saying that now the lease cost for electric cars in every single area of demand, from small cars all the way through to large cars, is now lower than that of conventional vehicles. But they're bridging this gap, and ultimately it's these business model innovations are just very clever ways to bridge some of the capital cost gaps which still exist. But yeah, I think we've seen some. We'll see a lot more. I mean, what will be really interesting now is as they start to expand into the heat industry and the industrial sector, where you're facing more recalcitrant opposition. Business models could be extremely helpful in those areas.
Exactly right. And your point about moving from the emergence or gestation stage into the mass stage, which is the second one on the S curve, I call it the disruptive stage, is that once a technology's market share gets to 10%, I think actually you make the point that it's between 5 and 10% is the inflection point. And if you think of it as we talk about hockey stick growth. So if you think about that inflection point, it's the heel of the blade on the hockey stick. And once it passes the heel, then it's on the shaft of the hockey stick going up at a very, very rapid rate. And we are between 5 and 10% and higher on almost all of them. I wasn't going to say all, it's a kind of a blanket statement, but maybe we can say all of the key technologies for this energy transition.
Well, actually we are. And I really want to make a point here, which I have to admit, I, in the early years, looking at this issue, have been a little bit lax about, and I see a lot of analysis is not looking at this. You've got to distinguish between flows and stocks when you're looking at change taking place on an S curve. And so that is to say, the sale of cars, if 80 million cars a year sold, that's the flow, and then the stock is the stock of 1,000 million cars. The point to me is that if you're looking for evidence of change, you only have to look at the flow. Forget about the stock. The stock, inevitably, once you get to 100% of the flow being new technology, the stock will follow in between X years later, X being between, let's say, 10 and 30 years. So all we have to look at analytically is what's happening to the stocks. And what's then really interesting is that when you look at the world in those terms, solar and wind are much further advanced than people realize. At 90% of new capacity globally now is solar and wind, and we're basically already there actually in the electricity sector, and in the transportation sectors. It's on a global level, we're going to hit like in 2023 around 20%. But again, forget about all these arguments about how long it takes for the stock to change. As soon as the flow has shifted, the stock it's a kind of question of inevitability. And the similar story is happening in heat pumps, where it's now approaching 20% of sales. So it's really extraordinary when you start to look at the flows of these technologies, how quickly they pierce through these inflection points.
Well, let's talk about wind and solar for a moment, because one of the reasons why they're beginning to, they're going to take 90% of new generating capacity in the coming years is because there's been a lot of innovation in other areas that enable them to dominate or to take a bigger percentage of the grid over time. And I'm thinking of things like market design. If you have, like, if you look at the United States, where there's a lot of trading in between, regions, market design had a lot to do with the penetration of wind and solar. You also have storage innovation. So just a couple of weeks ago, I interviewed Salient Energy, which is a good example of, they're coming out with the zinc ion battery for stationary storage. It's 30% cheaper than lithium ion, and it doesn't explode. It's completely safe. And it can, you can work at the utility scale or at residential scale. And then you've got other things like, compressed air storage. There's so much innovation going on to smooth the way for the integration of a higher and higher percentage of renewables and intermittent renewables, that innovation is only just getting started. So never mind the cost. It's that other innovation that becomes the enabler of the key energy technology.
And this is true, but it's also has been true in other major technology shifts. I mean, Carlota Perez, for example, talks about 6 major technology shifts. And one of her very cogent observations is that you often get 2 or 3 innovations in 2 or 3 separate but linked areas which enable the whole to happen, steel and railways, for example. In the case of storage, it really has been astonishing. I mean, as I think both of us would acknowledge, a couple of years ago, it wasn't really that big a deal. People weren't talking about it that much. Now, if I take the BNEF numbers, they've upped their storage forecast by 40% this year. We're now talking about 2030 levels of lithium-ion battery storage, 10 times higher of new deployment than it is this year. So kind of storage is also moving very quickly up its S-curve. And as an aside, since you mentioned intermittency, it's very interesting. The latest IEA piece, which is talking about the various different impediments to change, they talk about permitting, grids, and in the global south and capital, the rest of it. They never talk about intermittency, because actually it's really, folks, not the barrier to change that everyone wants you to think it is. It's absolutely a soluble problem, and batteries is one of the many ways you can solve it.
Yeah, that's exactly right. I mean, I interviewed the CEO of a power association in the American Midwest. It was a collection of 42 rural co-ops, and they are at 35% renewables today. They'll be at 70% by 2030, and they'll be at 100% sometime during the 2030s. And it's over time, everyone is figuring out how to do this. And the technology gets better, which then makes it easier to do it. And I can understand why there's a lag between what's happening on the ground and the public understanding of this, because some of these old narratives, as you know, you and I have written a lot about energy narrative, and they take root, and they're really, really hard to uproot, to modify. And yeah,
this is our job, I guess.
Well, it is in part is to develop. I mean, there are new narratives, and we're talking about a number of them, and I think over time, and not in the next 3 to 5 years, a lot of those narratives are going to be exploded, and we're going to see a much greater public acceptance of things like wind and solar. I mean, I'm talking about North America now, where they're just really catching hold. Well, I shouldn't say that. I mean, California and so on. But anyway, On
Well,
to the
actually,
next.
I'd like to try, if I may, for the first time, an analogy, because again, we play a lot with analogies, I guess. But this idea that you need constant availability of wind and solar, and without it, they're invalid. It's a little bit like having a salary, right? You have a salary, and then somebody says, "Come along." Basically, somebody comes to you and says, "Would you like to do some work in your spare time?" And you'll earn some money doing that. And you do that, and then you do a bit more, and essentially you get more and more work from more and more money from the work you're doing in your spare time, and that just means you can actually reduce working 5 days a week to 4 to 3 on your conventional job, and it's exactly the same story here. And nobody says, well, you can't possibly do that. You've got to turn this money down. It's the same thing for us. We have all these new sources materializing, solar and wind. Every time you put a solar panel up, it reduces the amount of gas you use. Doesn't matter, it doesn't work at night. It's completely irrelevant. It just you're using less gas, and it's that which is causing the disruption. Anyway, sorry. But yeah, it's this kind of narrative, I think, that we're seeking to challenge. But ultimately, actually, people who fail to recognize that the world is changing actually damage their own cause. That's, I think, the other point that we want to make in broad terms. We can have this fight, as it were, with fossil fuel incumbents when they're never going to necessarily come around to it, but when they start to recognize that actually it's happening for real anyway, and that it's damaging them by not recognizing reality, as it were, that's the moment I think they start to change. Anyway, sorry, I slightly digress, but yeah.
Well, I can add a little bit of to that argument, because I see it in the Alberta oil sands, which is Canada's largest source of crude oil, and they have the potential for a pivot here into producing feedstock, basically their bitumen, for materials production, particularly carbon fiber to begin with, and then asphalt binder and activated carbon, and potentially others as the processes are developed. And they see that right now as just a little sideline. They're modeling for out to way past 2050 to be competitive in even a 25 million barrel a day global oil market. There's a problem right there, is that they can't see the existential threat to their industry, and that if they were prudent, they would begin that transition, be talking about it now, planning for it now, so that when the transition accelerates and we hit the peak for crude oil, say around 2030, and then we get on to the peak or the decline curves, and we'll talk about those in a minute, then they've got another option. They've got a plan B that actually could generate more value for them. So since I've introduced the idea of your peaks, why don't you tell us how that works?
Well, again, it's all very, very simple math. As the new grows, the old stuff inevitably stops growing, and then as the new grows even bigger, then the old stuff starts to decline. I mean, to put some numbers around that, if global energy demand in broad numbers is 600 exajoules, growing at 1% a year, that's about 6 exajoules. And in the past, that was all fossil fuels provided all of that growth. And now solar and wind, if you count them at least the way that BP does, they themselves are growing by around 6 exajoules a year. So they have become large enough to take all of the growth. Therefore, there is no growth left for the fossil fuel system, which means that by definition, demand has peaked. I mean, that's the very broad picture framing. But what's really interesting then is, and we did a little piece of analysis, is too strong to call it analysis, just an observation that over the last 10 years to get to this happy moment where renewables are big enough to take all of the growth. It's been quite painful and difficult. Electric vehicles have gone from 0 to 17 million. And that's been very hard and required a huge amount of innovation and so on and so forth. But actually, over the next decade, as they move up the S-curve, it's going to be considerably easier to get much greater amounts of growth. So, there is a debate at the moment if EV, total number of EV in 2030 is going to be 250 or 300 million. I don't know, but it's going to be an awful lot more than 17. And that's the point. Which is you get a massive surge of growth, and therefore, if already today in 2022 we're already talking about renewables basically taking all of the growth. As you go on up the decade, it becomes even more obvious every single year that there's simply no room left for fossil fuel technologies to grow.
Okay, so let's say they hit the peak, then there's a plateau. What happens during the plateau?
So I guess, I mean, coal is a classic example. It hits its peak in 2013 and it's plateaued basically now for about a decade. So you in financial market terms, you get two deratings. I would suggest you get a first derating when you go from growth to a plateau. And we've already kind of seen that in various different areas of the fossil fuel system. But then I would suggest you get a second derating when you go from the end of the plateau to decline. And when people actually work out that assets simply will no longer be required. And we haven't yet seen that second derating. But yeah, there's kind of in financial market terms, two deratings. Then you get, during this long plateau, you get this kind of battle between incumbents who say, well, it's just a temporary phenomenon and don't worry, and growth is going to come back and it's all going to be fine. Versus the challenging technologies kind of salivating at the great prospect of all the growth they can take, all of the market share that they can take, and then continue to grow very rapidly. So you are going to get a plateau for a number of years, simply again because of the mass of the thing.
Okay, now there are two peaks that you described, the Matterhorn and the Fuji. Could you explain those, please?
Well, sorry for the slightly cute framings, but the Matterhorn peak is a very spiky peak. You basically go up and then you go down, and something like car sales would be a classic Matterhorn peak. It peaks at 80 million units in 2017, and now it's down to, actually I haven't got the numbers on my fingertips, but let's just say assume it's 70 and then approaching clearly 60s in sight as electric vehicles start growing. So that's a classic Matterhorn peak. But oil demand for cars, because you still have the 1,000 million cars, that's going to kind of plateau for a few years because you still have new cars coming into the system, more or less outweighed by old ICE cars coming out of the system. But it takes a while for the fleet itself to change. And that's why you get a Mount Fuji-like plateau. That is to say, it's kind of a flat top with various different bumps in it. And of course, I actually a few people have pointed out to me that Fuji has got a big hole in the middle because, of course, it's an old volcano. But nevertheless, it's which is, you're possibly getting too cute with the analogies here. But anyway, the point to me is that it is a bouncy, bumpy top where until the stock of the new challenging technology gets big enough to mean that you decline. But ultimately, the point I guess about a Mount Fuji plateau is that when you do get to the end of it, your decline is just as precipitous as it will be on a Matterhorn decline, because at that point your challenging technology is considerably larger. So I mean, if I make the observation after the coal sector reaches its peak around 2013. It's been bouncing along on a plateau for a while. And this year the IEA says it's going to be basically the same as it was in 2013, because of course of gas to coal switching. But in the meantime, solar and wind is now 12% of the electricity system, still growing at 20% a year. Back in 2013, it was let's say 4% of the electricity system. Now it's considerably larger and considerably more capacity to do damage. So I would suggest now the coal sector, for what it's worth, is reaching the end of its plateau.
And there are a number, while the old technology, the old energy commodity is bumping along on the plateau. I mean, there are a number of reasons for that, other than just things like, the stock of the new technology hasn't reached a critical level yet. I mean, the incumbents begin to push back. Governments sometimes, and I see this in Canada all the time, the government, both the federal government and particularly the Alberta government, have become so accustomed to the royalties and the taxes provided by the oil and gas industry that they're rushing to subsidize decarbonization. I mean, the oil sands industry has asked for $50 billion to help pay for its decarbonization by 2050. And then there, sometimes the incumbent is able to make its product better, increase its efficiency or lower its costs. I mean, I keep hearing from the oil and gas types that, oh no, it's going to be a bumpy transition. Well, duh. Transitions are not smooth. If you go back, if you look at the 1920s and, the horses to cars and tractors and trucks, that was not smooth. You don't change something as humongous as the global energy system smoothly. And then, of course, you have shocks. We have the COVID-19 pandemic started in 2020. We have the Russia's invasion of Ukraine that were huge shocks to the system and raised energy security concerns and price concerns. So can you explain a little bit about incumbents pushing back and the role of shocks in speeding up the energy transition?
Yeah, so I mean, the way we framed it is that for the energy transition technologies, solar and wind batteries and electric vehicles and heat pumps and so on, the technology issues were basically solved 10 or 20 years ago. The economics issues have been solved within the last 5 to 10 years. And now the only thing maintaining the incumbent system is kind of inertia and, strangely enough, as you mentioned, political support, particularly in petrostates. So that so far so good is absolutely normal. And you can maintain a system for a while. One of the problems, though, as an observation, is that 90% of people, so only 10% of people live in petrostates, and all of the growth in energy demand, for what it's worth, is basically coming from India and China and the other emerging markets, most of which have very little fossil fuels, and therefore inevitably, they will be embracing these new technologies, and therefore, if you're a major fossil fuel exporter, there's nothing you can do about that. If your demand's no longer there, then there's you can't force them to burn stuff. So that's I guess how the role of the incumbents and the kind of limited capacity of the incumbents to withhold to stop change ultimately. Then when it comes to shocks, well, the classic observation is that shocks bring forward change. In this as in any other area. COVID. During both COVID and Putin's war, you've seen a massive hit to fossil fuel demand, but actually solar and wind specifically have carried on growing. So that therefore brought the peak demand that we're talking about forward by several years.
What about I guess what I'm getting at here is when are we going to see the technologies get up on the S curve to the point where the decline is really quite significant? And I remember interviewing somebody, an economist from Wood Mackenzie 5-6 years ago, and they were saying, because they have oil and gas clients, all of their oil and gas clients are very interested in the decline curve. Will it have a big shoulder? Will it have will it be rapid, small shoulder, and it'll be rapid decline? Is the 2030s, is that the decade when we're really going to see this play out, and heading into the 2040s where both coal, oil, and natural gas will all be clearly in terminal decline?
So, Markham, I mean, you called this earlier. This is the decade of disruption. If you haven't pivoted by the end of this decade, it will be too late. I think that much is absolutely clear. We are today, if I take the BNEF forecasts in 2022, we will install 270 gigawatts of solar and about 110 gigawatts of wind. That's enough to produce about 600 or 700 terawatt hours of electricity, which is all the world's electricity demand growth. By the end of this decade, we'll be it'll be 2 or 3 times as much. And at that point, it becomes completely obvious that the old system is in decline. And I think what we can do now, again, coming back to my Mount Fuji observation and the coal industry, if we're right in saying that the coal industry is the end of its Fuji plateau, and the oil industry arguably reached the start of its Fuji plateau in 2019, by the end of this decade, it also got to the end of its plateau. It doesn't, financial markets will observe and see how this is happening in one technology in one country after the next, and it won't be hard to persuade financial market actors that the future lies in inevitable decline for gas as well by that stage.
Let's game this out a little bit. So if we're looking at the next 3 decades, it looks like to me that coal is already plateauing, as you made the point, and decline is coming fairly quickly. Oil is projected to peak in 2030, and
or earlier actually from our framing. But anyway, yeah.
Okay, fair enough. I was thinking of Bloomberg NEF. I just interviewed David Doherty, their head of oil analysis, a couple of months ago, and he thinks 2030, and so everybody's clustered around a little bit before 2030, a little bit after. And then the question, Bloomberg actually was surprisingly made the point, or they argued that the decline in oil consumption will not be as rapid as everyone thinks. I think they're going to go down for road transportation to like 36 million barrels a day by 2040, because aviation, demand from aviation and petrochemicals will keep rising. And there's also the argument that the developing world will continue to grow, and their energy consumption will grow, and that'll make up for some of the decline in the wealthier countries. And then natural gas seems to be the fossil fuel that will perhaps have the longest life and be part of the energy transition. You hear the arguments around it being a bridge fuel, a transition fuel. Is that a reasonable take? Coal now, oil in a decade, natural gas in a couple or 3 decades?
Well, not really. I think it's considerably faster than that. So if I'm the way we would say, if we take this framing, oil peaks 2013, plateaus till 2022. I think oil peaks 2019, plateaus till the middle of this decade, and then it's in clear decline. And we've heard all very, very frequently these observations about rising demand for aviation and petchem, which will allegedly be sufficient to withstand falling demand in trucks and cars and other areas of oil demand. But that is to argue from the assumption that nothing changes and there's no innovation taking place in the aviation sector. There's no innovation. There's no changes taking place amongst policymakers to put more pressure upon these industries to change. And I think that's unreasonable because we are seeing policy innovation. We are seeing policy changes. We are seeing technology innovation. So to kind of have a business as usual assumption for a couple of parts of oil demand, whilst the rest of it is being forced to change, seems to me unrealistic. And then this idea that you've got natural demand growth coming through in the emerging markets, also actually a very false framing, because the biggest area of demand is China. China is leading the shift towards electric vehicles. They've gone from 4% to 19% in the last couple of years of sales, and actually China's looking at 100% EV sales very, very clearly by the end of this decade, given their kind of their shift up the S curve. So India, of course, is seeking to follow in the same footsteps. Southeast Asia as well. So it's absolutely, I think, false framing to assume that the emerging markets will follow the kind of declining technologies in developed markets. That was kind of a good idea when the technologies were expensive. Now it's the cost of fullness no longer valid. And then finally about gas, can gas survive for considerably longer? I guess it kind of depends on price, right? I mean, 40% of gas goes into electricity generation, and there, as if you are indeed facing $10 solar wind by the end of this decade, and really cheap batteries, it doesn't seem credible to me that gas demand would be able to continue to grow. I mean, I recognize it's a much more finely balanced set of calculations for gas than for the other two, but nevertheless, as these technologies continue to grow and continue to undercut their opponents on price, it just becomes much harder for growth to materialize.
Okay, you and I are in agreement that the energy transition is accelerating rapidly, and the key technologies are well past their inflection points. Other enabling technologies are either there or past, and some are approaching their inflection point. I've been making the observation lately that the energy transition has reached the point where it has kickstarted an economic transformation, a global economic transformation. I mean, we need to build new industries to build these new technologies. We need wind plants, wind turbine plants, and solar panel plants. And we need, if we're going to build batteries, we don't just need critical minerals. We need the refining and processing of those minerals into metals. And then we have to take the metals and make them into battery components and then turn those into battery packs. I mean, that supply chain is not a small thing or an easy thing to build. Nevertheless, we have to build it. And so we're seeing enormous sums of capital go into that industry. So would you agree with the basic premise that the energy transition has already kicked off an economic transformation? And secondarily, if that's true, then how much time do we have to make that pivot?
Well, to give you a few numbers from the IEA publishes data on this issue once a year in the World Energy Investment publication. The spending on fossil fuels basically has gone from $1,400 billion a year down to about 800 or 900, and in the same period, spending on clean technologies has gone from about 800 to 1,400 or 1,300, I think. So there's been a very, very clear capital allocation pivot from fossil to renewables, and it's quite funny. You talk to fossil folks, they keep on whining about how it's a lack of investment in fossils which is causing this energy shock. Well, not really. It's just it's a reallocation to the new stuff, and what's caused the shock is Putin's war. But anyway, look, this is indeed kicking off a massive opportunity, and you talk to anyone, as you know, across the renewable energy supply chain, everything is tight. We have to indeed build the batteries and solar panels. And for me, one of the really interesting developments this year has been the provisions in the ARA for driving a build-up of basically the Western or the US and Western supply chain, because we really allowed, or the West allowed China to steal a march here and to dominate all of these industries. And now, with the invasion of Ukraine and there is a recognition this was not terribly smart politics, and we do need to build our own supply chain. I think you and I and many others have been saying this for a while. And now, therefore, it's great that that's happening. And it's not just in the US, and Europe's also seeking to build and strengthen its own supply chain. It's going to be a very it's a winners take all environment at the moment. Everyone's trying to do it. Everyone's trying to seize the growth opportunity. There are then kind of two debates. First of all, can we do it? Can we build this stuff quick enough to keep up with demand? And then the second debate is who's going to win. I don't really know who's going to win, but in terms of the can we do it? What's absolutely astonishing is if you look at stuff like solar panels. This year we're building 270 gigawatts of solar panels. The industry in China is totaling up to build 1,000 gigawatts by the end of this decade. A decade ago we were building 30. It's the most extraordinary story. The same thing with battery factory. Remember when Elon Musk Gigafactory was the first Gigafactory? Now there are like 250 of these things. So given the opportunity, people will allocate capital at enormous scale into growth industries, and that's what's happening. It's going to be very stressful, and there will be bottlenecks and problems to solve, but that's what money is very good at, flowing to solve those bottlenecks.
And at the current time, I've Bentley Allen from the Transition Accelerator makes this point. He's an expert on industrial strategy and policy, that these new supply chains are in flux today. They won't be in flux by 2030. They will have hardened because the capital will have been allocated, plant will have been built, supply chains around those plants will be coming into existence. And what that means is there's no time to tarry. Any country like Canada, for example, that is very reliant on oil. Oil and gas is far and away the biggest export from Canada. It's about $100 billion. The next is automobiles at about $65 billion. And so we rely on exports of oil and gas to pay for our lifestyle and to generate taxes and revenue and royalties that support our welfare state, support our social programs. And if we don't pivot and get into those new industries and create new supply chains, then after 2030-ish, we will have lost out. Because
indeed, you become like Britain at the end of the 19th century, which failed to reinvent itself for the technology shifts that were going on. It is absolutely no point being an ostrich and denying the technology shift that's going on, and particularly if you're a major fossil fuel exporter. I mean, we made this argument a few times to fossil fuel exporters. Actually, you guys should be at the vanguard of the change that's happening, because it's happening anyway. You can't stop it, and if you have to actually retool and reinvent your economies. And actually, it's interesting. You see very different approaches here. Russia's kind of has indeed stuck its head in the sand and is trying to produce more coal. Last time I talked to the guys, but Saudi Arabia, of course, has been allocating a lot of capital to companies like Aqua to build solar across the world, and Norway is definitely thinking very, very hard about how to maintain their lifestyle in a new world. So yeah, it's got to be done.
Well, we've talked about what needs to be done. We've talked a little bit about how it can be done and a little bit about when it needs to be done. Kingsmill, I appreciate your insights here. I enjoy our conversations. We'll have you back in 2023 as you continue to work on your theory and flesh it out a little bit. And particularly, you've already written a piece on changing energy narratives that I will definitely have you back to talk about that in the coming year. So Merry Christmas to you and your family, and all the best in the coming year.
Fantastic. Thanks a lot. Merry Christmas.